Well, I gotta see what we got picture-wise.
I put
I don't care for that at all.
what the heck? They're all off. There's no new. There's none in there.
Well, let's find out.
No.
Oh, that's right, because the batteries were removed.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, we'll start with number 1.
Backlight.
Backlight.
Up to the right.
Okay. Number 2.
Now we want the backlight off.
What's that, liver disease?
Whatever you're saying is going out over the net. We're turned on. That one's going. All you need to do, that you don't need to do anything but that one. The other one's the one you need. Oh, I see what you're trying to get at. All right. Let's start the recording.
Start the recording. Is going.
Okay, we're trying to clear up our technical difficulties. I think by next week we should be there. There are questions, but they are more for the Mysticism class, so we'll cover the questions next week. What we're going to do this evening is part 2 of a look at the 7th house of the Carl Jung horoscope. In part 1, we looked a little bit at the individuality of Jung, and we looked at the 7th house as the house of individuation. And we did that because that is extremely important to analytic psychology. That became the main work that Jung wanted to do, was individuation. Now, in doing the things that we're doing, we have looked so far at the Sun square Neptune. And we weren't especially deep, or we weren't completely thorough, because we can't do that. Even at doing 2 talks on one house, we're still going pretty fast. A real analysis would take many, many talks. One of the things that we concluded was that there were difficulties, individuality and individuation, as we might expect with the Sun square Neptune. Now, it's not meant to say that he was a self-deluded man or anything like that. It was much, much milder. Now, he claimed to have had an experience that when he was deluged in his consciousness by content from the unconscious. And the deluge was so severe that he thought he was temporarily psychotic, and it took him a while to come out of that. But he did come out of it, and when he came out, he was a much better man than before, and he was more self-knowing. My personal opinion is that he could very well have had a major spiritual experience at that time had he wanted to direct it in that way. Now, there are lingering misunderstandings that he had, and we all have them. We're not really very far on our journey toward the truth. Now, one important matter needs to be clarified, and that is you can't compare horoscopes with regard to spiritual development. You can't compare them on some kind of a standard scale, because there is no such thing as a standard scale. There would have to be another dimension, or at least another dimension, if not more. And the horoscope, as far as I know, any astrologer I've ever met doesn't know about those other dimensions. You can get it from intuition, and if you put intuition together with observation and deduction, you can do that, but you have to do that on an individual basis, seeing the person or interacting regularly with the person, which is not easily done. Now, if we tried to compare the horoscopes, you would think that Freud was more advanced because he had these very strong sun sextile Neptune, which was also, the sun was also in the 7th house. While Jung had the sun square Neptune from that same house. So if you tried to compare, you might think that way, but you can't do that. Now, if anything, from what we conceive about the life of Jung and observe him in that way, we can say that Jung was probably more advanced than Freud because he was aware of psychic and spiritual things, while Freud was checked in those matters because he had that materialistic atheism. So one can say, in relation to his own specific development with regards to things ruled by Neptune, that this is only within him, within Jung himself. He was at a stage of development for acute awareness. Now, Jung appeared to be at an early stage with regard to Neptunian things. In that, there was work on self and on spirituality which need to be done. And he was taking a crash course because things came on so fast. Now, he wasn't completely successful. He didn't become a spiritual initiate or something like that, but he did really well. He did much, much better than most humans in life. Now, Jung's situation appears to be a common situation of all people on spiritual quests. Very few develop controlled spiritual sight. Very few have out-of-the-body experiences completely under their control. We're all just moving along in that direction. Now, the spiritual worlds and what occurs in the spiritual worlds, things are very different there from here. We live in a very limited world here, and we live in a limited world because we're such beginners that we're not ready for something much more complicated and much more with all the things going on that go on within. So we all have a lot of work ahead of us. And what I'm trying to do is to not fault Jung because he wasn't some great spiritual master or something like that. Now, for a few moments, let's look at some of the problems he encountered with self-knowledge. We've already seen that there are some difficulties about his ability to come to accurate self-knowledge, but let's look at some of the problems that came out because of that. And we'll begin talking a little bit of astrology, and then we'll move on to psychology, and then along the way we'll come to mysticism. Now, in this horoscope, the sun is in Leo, and it rules Leo, and it's in the 7th house. And because it is in its own sign, it is self-disposed. And because it rules the cusp, he is self-depositive. He has the key to his own destiny as far as 7th house matters are concerned. And it's because of this rulership, he's likely to be more self-determined than most people are. When especially with Leo, there would be a very strong self-reliant streak to his consciousness. And he would like to be a standalone individual. He did a lot of that in his life. He had this retreat on an island on the lake. He called it Bollingen, and he built it by himself, stone by stone. And everything that was in there, he did for himself. Preparing his food and everything else, it was sort of his retreat, his escape. Now, if we look at Jung's sun in Leo in the 7th house, there is a problem. It's an astrological and spiritual problem, and almost any situation has problems built into it. The sun is conjoined to the descendant, which means it is opposite to the ascendant. If the positioning were opposite, if the sun was conjoined to the ascendant, that would be the signature of a self-made person, someone who was able to be a completely standalone individual. So in this, we're seeing an attitude toward being a standalone person, but the circumstances are such that he has to be dependent on someone, or he needs an alter ego or a partner. Now, because of his strength, he was able to, in partnership, have his own way. That's one of the downsides of this. You don't really appreciate the partnership because of the wanting to be a standalone person. Now, if the sun is in the 7th house, that often indicates a spouse-made individual. But it didn't mean that in this case. Now, this being driven into the 7th house with an attitude where he'd like to be standalone is magnified by the fact that Saturn is in the 1st house. It's a strong Saturn. It's a very benign Saturn, but it is still Saturn. And Saturn is that planet of blocking and obstruction. So he couldn't get himself out into the world the way he would have liked to have done, and he was basically locked into the 7th house. It wasn't like a prison, but there was a reliance and a dependence that he may or may not have realized. You see, if you become too much of a standalone person, you're not fulfilling the 7th house. You're away from things, and in reality, his wanting to be this self-reliant person was in some ways to his detriment. And if he could have given himself more to his partner, he could have benefited. But that's one of the problems with this kind of a setup. Now, much to his credit, as life went on, he did get more and more into his marriage, and he did realize how much he needed the significant other and what the significant other could do for him. By the time he was done at the end of his life, when she had passed on, his statement was, "She was my foundation." Now we want to get a little bit at the psychology of this, and we have to go back to the subject that we brought up when we discussed the Freud seventh house, and that is transference, projection transference. Projection is the phenomenon of seeing something that we're only partly or mostly unconscious of in someone else. We're basically using someone else as a mirror. And transference is a projection, an intentional use of projection in a one-on-one relationship. Usually, in a psychotherapeutic relationship, the term applies mostly, that's where it is used mostly, but it also applies in marriage. Often the marriage partner is what we aren't, and what we are needing to be or wanting to be. That's if the marriage is healthy. Now, in a therapeutic relationship, as the therapist develops a trusting relationship with the patient feels more free to project onto the therapist. And in a good therapeutic relationship, everything that is ripe to be healed is projected, and it's projected onto the therapists. This includes what we like about ourselves, what we don't like about ourselves, things that we're harboring in ourselves, things like that. In transference, the therapist, as we said before, needs to be very aware of what's being projected. The therapist also needs to be very self-aware that the therapist sees themselves as they are, and not as an angel or a devil, as they would seem in some of the projections. Now, just as a lifesaver at the beach needs to be aware of his or her strength as a swimmer in order to save someone's life, or else there would be a double disaster. And the therapist is in the same place. If the therapist isn't psychologically aware or clear, you have a comparable situation. Not necessarily that there's going to be a double death or anything like that, but it gets pretty messy. So it's imperative that anyone who studies psychological or spiritual help work must take very careful, scrupulous self-analysis. Now, something new. Projection goes both ways in a one-on-one relationship. Probably all of us have been in relationships in which both partners projected inner faults on the other. It gets ugly. And what amplifies the ugliness is what we're seeing is true, even though we're not admitting that we have it in us. So that's a tough, ugly situation. Now, in one-on-one psychotherapy, when an agent projects onto the patient, that is called countertransference. This magnifies even more the need to be self-knowing and self-aware. Not all things that happen in psychotherapy are sweetness and love. Now we can see the difficulty that Jung faced with the Sun square Neptune. There was, because of the dimensionality of Neptune's spiritual otherworldliness, there was a difficulty that he didn't always see himself clearly. Sometimes he was overwhelmed with parts of himself that he didn't know. Now, the things that I'm saying are not meant to be critical or judgmental. I'm trying to be very objective and very clear, because I realize that I myself have an afflicted seventh house, and I have gotten into some very messy countertransference relationships in working with astrology. Now, combining what we said just a few minutes ago about the desire for self-sufficiency when the circumstances weren't there, and astrologically described situation that he couldn't be that way. And when we add that together with what we said about the Sun square Neptune, we see the problem that Jung faced throughout life. The possibility for countertransference with this setup was high. That's not to say that Jung was completely unaware of the situation, because he was somewhat aware of it. Now, the Sun in Leo rarely has small self-esteem. The Sun in Leo sees things and does things in a big way, in a grand way. Thus, with the Sun in Leo in the seventh house, he saw himself as the man, or as the partner, or as the individuating individual in a very big way. He didn't see himself as some kind of a social person or a societal person, but in a psychological way, because we have Uranus and Neptune in that house. Now, he felt he needed a great partner. His wife was wealthy. And for his spiritual well-being, he thought he needed more than one counterpart. At two different times in his life and his practice, he had open affairs with a mistress. As a sidelong matter, Freud had some very acutely accurate comments on the matter. One was that Jung's affairs were a matter of countertransference. And when we look at it astrologically, it certainly seems true. And another thing that Freud said was that the affairs were the consequence of unsuccessfully marrying for money, which may be partly true, maybe not. And on the other hand, the marriage lasted for life, and his wife, Emma, became interested and proficient in analytic psychology, so it was a sharing type of partnership. As said earlier, Jung did admit that he had social and psychological indebtedness to her. She was his foundation. Now, to see how all of this came about and worked out, we have to turn to the other planet in the seventh house. We have Uranus in the seventh house. And Uranus, like Neptune, has the feeling of truth. in when you experience it. Whether it is completely true or not, you have that feeling of truth. It may or may not be true if you misunderstand what could be an accurate intuitive experience. In my personal experience working with astrology, which cannot be taken as general knowledge, Uranus influences have even more of a feeling of certitude than the influences from Neptune. When you have the Uranian experience, you're absolutely sure that it's true. The chief difference between the two types of experiences is complexity. Neptune experiences are complex, and there are all sorts of unusual connections in them. Uranus experiences are more like lightning strokes. They're simple and they're sudden. Because there is connectedness, it's difficult for anyone to figure out these kinds of experiences as they relate to them. Sometimes people who have Uranian experiences, if you're meeting somebody who's just had Uranian experiences, some of their notions are daft. They seem hokey right away. They may or may not be. Uranus experiences are for now and for the future. Uranus wants change, and it demands change, and it demands immediate change. There is no regard for convention. There's no regard for precedent. Those things belong to the past, and Uranus is interested in now and the future. It even seems sometimes with Uranus that part of its motivation is to flout tradition or convention. Now, Uranus expressions like this might be expressed in anything. It might be in politics, it might be in art, it might be in the clothes that you wear, but it definitely does its own thing, probably more than any other planet in the whole list of planets. Now, Uranus in the Jung horoscope is in the 7th house. That's a social house. It did not seek to flout social norms. He didn't seek to flout public morals, but he didn't hesitate in the least to deviate from them. He had that leonine arrogance. I'm going to do what I want to do. It was as though he was indifferent to them. And Uranus rules Aquarius, which probably is the sign more than any other that is inclined toward indifference. So we can see an attitude here. Uranus forms one aspect, and it is a square to the moon. The moon, among a lot of other things, has to do with what we call Mother Nature. So to him, what he was experiencing and the impulses he was having with the moon square Uranus was completely natural. Now, in our times, it would be considered unethical, and he would lose his license to practice for having an affair with one of his patients. It probably was in his time too, but things were different. Things were much more wide open, sort of like the frontier, I guess. He almost surely had the feeling that what he was doing was right and true. In all of the writings that I've encountered from him and from biographers and other scholars talking about him, he never showed any remorse. He never showed any regret. So He probably did think everything he was doing was perfectly all right. The first instance was with a woman named Sabina Spielrein. And she was a Russian from a wealthy family. She eventually became a physician and a psychoanalyst. She was first a patient, and then she was a student, and then she was a lover for 2 years. Now, the whole affair is subjectively documented. It's in her diary and in letters between the two of them, and other Freudians knew about it. Sabina, all of her life, had a fantasy that she wanted to have Jung's child. But her claim was that there was sexual contact between them, but not sexual consummation. You don't know what it is. And both of them claim the same thing. Jung changed his story several times about it, but mostly claims it was poetic and highly romantic. And with Uranus involved, and wanting to escape the rigors of marriage and wanting to escape all of that powerful Saturn, romance would be a good way to do it. And again, Uranus rules romance. Jung, as we've seen before, was a deeply pondering person. He was a deep scholar, a very wide-read scholar, and that's another thing that would be more dry than he wanted life to be. So there's some kind of a conservation of the soul that his being involved with all of these pondersome things required something else in his soul for a relief. And he found it in exotic affairs. Now, the affair with Sabina didn't end very well. At one point, she went back to Freud and became a psychoanalyst, and then she returned to Zurich. And when she returned to Zurich, she came to turn him in. She was going to turn him into his boss at the Bergholzli institution where he was working. But then, I guess, when she saw him again, the fantasy about bearing his child took over, and she never did turn him in. Now, Jung was attracted to and was attractive to a lot of young women. He was not a Casanova. He didn't form all kinds of personal liaisons with them, but he liked it. And his words were almost literally, "They satisfy my polyamorous nature," which is an Iranian thing. Now, about 2 years after his final parting with Sabina, Toni Wolff appeared on the scene. Now, all of the main women in his life, his wife Emma, Sabina, and Toni, all of them were wealthy. The moon and Neptune being in Taurus indicates something like that. All of the women in his life were intelligent. And all of the women in his life, to some extent, collaborated with him in his work. That's seventh house. Let's work together. It was not just romantic relationships, but there was intellectual partnership. This is true especially of Toni Wolff. Many people thought that Toni Wolff was a better practitioner as a psychotherapist than Jung himself, and there's a lot of testimony to that end. Now, she was interested, before she met Jung, she was interested in mysticism, she was interested in philosophy, she was interested in astrology. She was one of us. She wanted an academic education, but her father was old-fashioned, and he denied it. He wouldn't send her to the university. And when that happened, she went into a deep depression. And in that prolonged depression, she was sent to Jung in order to be healed. Now, he was very impressed with her, especially with her intelligence. As she improved, she herself became interested in him and in his work. And she became a principal collaborator in a lot of the works that he did. And some of the technical terms that he uses in his psychology, the terms animus and anima, are attributed to her. Now this is ironic because Jung, when he started the affair with her, said, "This is the anima woman that I have longed for so long." And to get at what the anima woman is, we have to take a little side trip into mysticism. Now, mystics claim that inside of this physical body is an etheric vital body. And it interpenetrates the physical body, and it stands between the physical body and all the higher spiritual worlds. It's sort of like a two-faced interface between the within and the without. Now, the etheric body is cell for cell like the physical body, except in gender. And there's some kind of balance there, that the extremity of one gender outwardly is balanced by the gender from within. And this is what happens, like when you first start seeing people in the inner worlds, clairvoyantly, people that you know. It's surprising because often some of the people you know appear to be in the opposite gender of what they are when they're in their physical body. Now, Jung recognized this relationship to the inner worlds, though he wouldn't use those terms, that he recognized this polar opposite. And he thought that was the gateway to the unconscious. That was the gateway to what we would call the spiritual worlds. And to him, it was something like Dante's Beatrice, who leads Dante through the heaven worlds in the Divine Comedy. Now, in mysticism, and as an aspirant develops inner power and develops the inner opposite, the interaction between the inner and the outer is an essential part of soul growth. We become balanced male, female human beings. Now, in this, the spouse is very important, because the spouse, again, is a reflection from within of exactly what we need to develop in ourselves. That's if there's a healthy marriage. If there's a partitioned marriage where the person is what we aren't and we let them be that, there's no growth in that. Now, for Jung, the anima woman was highly important. Obviously, it was with all that stuff in the seventh house. But I don't know how to say it. I don't know if an anima woman was essential. And I don't know whether that wasn't part of that Sun and Leo's egoism, like I deserve something more. But in any case, she became his collaborator and his lover. She was even allowed at times to accompany him to Bollingen, which Emma never did. And for a while, this is how extreme it is, for a while she even was moved into the family home. And the only thing that Emma would not allow her to eat with the rest of the family, with the kids and all, except on Sunday, which she was doing before she moved in. Now, things went on this way. Jung had basically two women who knew about each other, shared the same house and everything else. And this went on until at a point in his life he started studying alchemy. And Toni Wolff didn't like alchemy because she thought it would take analytic psychology too far away from Christianity. So she didn't follow him in that. And so that's the relationship started to cool there. And then he had a heart attack. And after he had a heart attack, he almost withdrew from her completely. She still hung around, and she was part of the inner circle that, with Marie von Franz and others, they were developing analytical psychology, and she was part of that. Now, this is all very Uranian. Uranus doesn't care about convention. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. When Uranus is with one of the emotional planets, like the Moon or Venus or sometimes Mars, it acts in terms of what is called free love. Now, Jung never said that he was in favor of free love, but in effect of living with his anima woman, he was living it. Now, the Moon, in affliction with either Mars or Uranus, believes in passional fluidity. This is the kind of people that feel it's unhealthy to restrain oneself in any way sexually, and that to be sexually active is good. And they feel that way whether it's socially agreeable or not. Now, in looking at all of this, we don't want to just gossip about what happened. There is a question of great importance, and that seems to be, did this or these affairs promote individuation? Now, that's a hard question to answer, and you'd have to be there for first-hand observation. But if you look at his works, the frequency of his works, the quality of his works, and that part of his life, that's pretty linear. It just keeps growing and becoming more expansive. And if you look at it relative to when he was with Sabina or the time when he was with Toni, you don't see all kinds of spikes or bumps or anything like that. So it doesn't appear, to me, looking from the outside, that there were any great changes in him. It doesn't seem to me that an anima woman and having an anima woman and a wife simultaneously can promote psychological health. I think he was basically gratifying himself in an ego sense, not necessarily he wasn't a sex maniac or something like that. And then in that same statement at the end of his life, when his wife had passed on, this is what he said. Emma was his foundation, and Toni was his perfume. When she died, he didn't even go to the memorial service, but Emma did. That's a really crazy situation. The situation was a deadlock because all of the planets involved here, there's 6 planets in fixed signs, and 4 of them in this setup that we're looking at with Uranus and Neptune, they're all in fixed signs. So it's a deadlock situation. When he started coming close with Toni, she pressured him to leave Emma and be with her. And he wouldn't do that. And of course, Emma put pressure on him that, she wasn't pleased with the situation. Break it off with her. and he wouldn't have any of that either. So as it worked out, both women had to settle with the situation as it was and make the best of it, which is what they did. So he got exactly what he wanted, which is funny, almost ironic, because it was that kind of self-oriented attitude that brought on this situation in the first place. And the situation as it worked out was not a cure for his problems. It was a manifestation of them in a very strong, big way. Now, the affair doesn't seem to have any immediate obvious effect, though it did introduce new Iranian influence into his life stream. It might have brought him emotional relief. Uranus is a planet that does give a relief. Sometimes it's almost explosive and destructive. It gives relief that much. Now, in this whole business, there is one thing that I find fascinating about all of it, and that is the reaction of Emma. This is a remarkable woman to put up with this, especially since she was independently wealthy and didn't have to. Now, there isn't time to look at all three horoscopes, but that can be done because the data is available, and some people have done very brief studies of them, some astrologers from Switzerland. Emma must have been Oranian in her own right, because she not only put up with everything, but she was even positive about it. One of her statements about the whole affair was, "When he comes back to me after having been with her, it is so much better between us." Now, apparently, she benefited more than Jung did. But it puzzled me, and it still does puzzle me. I don't understand it. The tone of that statement is almost identical to the statements of wives whose husbands are polyamorous or swingers. They say that the sex is much better when he comes back after having been with another woman. And, I just, hard for me to grasp all of that. Causes me to question some of my own values. It's possible to me that one becomes inured or callous to these kinds of things, and after they go on for a while, and maybe one doesn't have the emotional depth and sensitivity for the rarer kinds of feelings. Perhaps there is relief and more in all of this. Uranus is a planet of freedom, but I hardly think of that as freedom. This might be some glimpse of freedom, but I don't know that freedom is to be found in having a mistress. So this all took place in Switzerland. Switzerland is a very prim and proper place, not what we would expect at all. Now, this is as far as we're going to go with this, because it's time to do something else. Now, one thing that I have learned in life is that things won't always be the way you want them to be. To try to have it that way turns out to be selfish and frustrating. Show me a person that always gets his or her way, and you're showing me a selfish person. Now, beside all of the unexpected and some of the undesirable things that come that we don't want, life is better with them than if we plan too much. It's the unexpected, the new things that are different. So I didn't want to do things this way, but I have to. The next topic we're going to look at is another Uranus topic, and we won't have a chance to really delve into Uranus for the rest of the way around the horoscope, so we have to do it now. Uranus and Aquarius rule some facets of mathematics. Or Aquarius rules statistics in large data sets. And Uranus and Aquarius also rule chance and probability. And Uranus especially rules coincidences. And coincidences are our second topic for this evening. Now, before delving into this, I have to make a serious request. Please listen very carefully, because some things that I say run counter to a lot of fads in spiritual seeking. What we're talking about is something that some people think is a valid principle, but it isn't what they think it is. Now, if I were famous and misunderstood, there would be an uproar against me. But sometimes not being famous is a great blessing. Now, I have studied this very carefully. I've read the book on it by Jung twice, very carefully. And this has been carefully deliberated for a number of years now. So the following is going to be much more about spiritual philosophy than it is about astrology and psychology. But it is important because a lot of people are going with a concept that I don't think they really understand the validity or non-validity of it. All right. First, we look at some words. The word synchrony means happening at the same time. And when there is an event where two things or more happen at the same time, it's called a synchronism. The word coincide means to occupy the same space or happening in the same space. The word coincidence means to occupy the same space but with no meaningful connection. As we say, it was only a coincidence. Now, all of these are definitions that are in concordance with the dictionary. Now, Carl Jung coined a new word and a concept, which is called synchronicity, which is now also in the dictionary, unfortunately. Synchronicity is a synchrony or a synchronism with meaning, but without causality. I'll repeat that because it's important. Synchronicity is a synchrony with meaning, but without causality. That two or more things happening together, there's a meaningful connection between them, but there is no cause behind it. He called it an acausal principle. One could say that it's meaningful coincidence, but not intentionally as a caused event. So let's give some examples. Suppose several people around the world have a near identical inner image of a 737 going down, and then such a plane goes down under the conditions described by the people who had this inner vision, that is a synchronicity. There is a connected network of experience around the event, but the people who reported the event before it happened didn't cause it. It was an accident, at least as the world thinks, and accidents are ruled by Uranus. There is no special meaning to the event except for the people that were in the plane. There it's meaningful, or people that are close to them. Now Jung gives his own examples. And one of the examples that he gives is the ancient Chinese divination system called I Ching. To him, the system works as it does for many people. But I Ching doesn't cause the conditions. It describes a means that meaning can be brought out of throwing sticks or coins or even dice. In other words, there is a connection between I Ching, the things described, and the individual applying to the I Ching. But the connection is not a causal connection. And the classic example that is given by Jung is he was working with a patient for a long time on a very difficult situation, and suddenly in a session, the patient makes a breakthrough in self-understanding. At that very moment, at the window, a moth, I forget the specific kind of moth it was, but that was also part of it, and appeared, and it was as if that was an omen or something that related to the breakthrough the person had just made. Moths have for a long time been symbols of the soul. Now, Jung calls this a synchronicity. This is a very meaningful experience, as I see it, but it is not a causal. Now, many people use the word synchronicity and believe in it without having really investigated it or thought it out. I Ching does work for most people or some people. But Uranus things are like that. They're dazzling. They're dazzling to the point of destruction. Uranus people like to wear bright, dazzling clothes. Now, you know that something true and marvelous has happened in this coincidence. And in those feelings, we make assumptions which may or may not be true. Personally, I am not bedazzled. The validity of synchronicity depends on the word causality. There is direct causality. If you're playing pool and you cause the cue ball to hit another ball and direct the other ball into the pocket, that is a direct causality. It is what most scientists consider causality. And Jung was wanting to appeal to science. In fact, he considered himself a scientist. Now, if that is what Jung meant by causality, I mostly agree with him. But that leaves synchronicity hanging in the air. In mysticism, there's a conception called indirect causation. The concept, some of the uses of the word indirect causation might not appeal to some people, especially most Republicans. If there are slums and squalid conditions that breed crime and disease, that's a kind of independent causality. If a person grows up under those conditions and doesn't see anything else and becomes a criminal, somebody didn't cause that person to become a criminal, but the indirect influence of the environment caused it. True, the individual had a choice of becoming a criminal or not, but not many people are that strong that they can resist all of the influences of the greater environment. Now, another example of indirect causality can be found in attitude to one's relation toward life itself. Some days it seems that God is in God's heaven and all is well. Everything seems to fall into place. Things come out just as we think they should. And the thing is, if we practice attitude management, those days become more and more frequent, especially if our ends are less selfish. There's a focus of selfishness in direct causation that is anathema to indirect causation. It's this kind of causality that one realizes that one is much more than one's physical personality. One realizes that one is a part of a macrocosmic causality, which isn't like the pool ball. You're putting things out there and it creates or it causes in a different way. So indirect causality involves divine spiritual activity, and it means that we are part of the macrocosm. We aren't just a little self, we are actually creating in the macrocosm, and very often that redounds on the individual. Jung could not take this view because it's pure mysticism, and that would be unacceptable to material science. Material science doesn't always agree that slums or filthy conditions necessarily produce illnesses. Now, it's not clear to me whether Jung himself believed it. He may have believed this but didn't say things. Sometimes I think that's true, sometimes I think it's not true. Now, having psychic experiences and being familiar with mystical philosophy does not mean that one is ready to live mysticism. And that's what Jung's case was. He denied or declined mysticism. Rudolf Steiner said of Carl Jung, he could have had complete or full clairvoyance if he wanted to. But he did not want to. So this leaves us with a metaphysical question about synchronicity. Stated real simply, in what is the connection of meaning that results in synchronicity? You know, meaning isn't just hanging in the air. It doesn't belong to. It's that it's something that is not part of either spirit or matter. That's simplifying it greatly. It clearly was not some state of matter, or he would have found it, or scientists would have some clue as to it. But no. As we've seen, he didn't accept that there was some state of spirit, that there was a spiritual truth in which meaning could be found. And so he had no place for meaning to be. It was just meaning. Now, it would be nice to have a world of meaning that was neither spirit nor matter, in which we humans could participate along with everything else, but it doesn't work that way, because that is really a definition of mysticism and mystical experience. Jung never expressed how synchronistic experiences occur. Other parts of his worldview are the same way. Like the collective unconscious. He doesn't say where it is. He just says it's there, but it's not spiritual and it's not mere material. Some people would say, he'd say it's all in his mind. The same thing is true with the archetypes. He studiously avoided metaphysical and theological issues. I don't know whether it was intentional or unintentional, but some of that will come out as we go on to further talks. When he is pressed, when he's made a statement like the statement about synchronicity, and he's pressed, he would say, I'm only speaking psychologically. I'm not speaking metaphysically or scientifically. I'm only speaking psychologically. And that was always his dodge. It's very frustrating reading him. So the connectivity is obvious. We can see that there are sort of blessed synchronies, but it is mystic. It's coming from something higher. Now, one of the questions in my mind that I've had for a long time and I don't have an answer, and you might have an answer for. What are the long and short-term effects of living a life under a belief system that is purely analytical psychology, without being materialistic or without being mystical? What does that produce? What type of personality? Now, I have a lot of friends who study a lot of Jung and try to live it in their lives, but all of them have something else. They have some kind of spiritual pursuit that they're following at the same time. I don't know that, but if anyone here or watching over the internet knows that or has experienced that, I would appreciate some feedback. This is the 99fots@gmail.com is where you go to send me some feedback or questions. And that's all there is for tonight. Any questions? Okay, thank you very much.